Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in again. I want to share a little story with you that goes back to my college days, and this is going to show you how you can present a bait in an unusual manner that will allow you to catch more fall and wintertime bass. This is a technique that I still use to date, and I figured out a long time ago. So, back 20 years ago, when I was back in school, I went to school at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, so we're kind of up in the middle of nowhere. You start in early September, right? And by October, you're pretty much in the middle of fall and water temperatures are dropping. So, my good buddy and I, we would go out fishing. We were one of the few guys at the time that were fishing. Most people at that point were going out hunting. And we used to go fishing. And one of the things that we loved to do was throw jerkbait around. And at that time, there were not all kinds of crazy options of different jerkbaits to throw. The reality of it is that was right around the time when the Vision 110 was still not very well known at all. I know in college I didn't have the money to spend on it. So our beta choice at that point was a Rattling Rogue, a Smithwick Rattling Rogue, which I think a lot of people considered one of the best jerkbaits, still do consider it a great jerkbait. The other option was the Husky Jerk, the Rapala Husky Jerk. So those were the two baits we would throw. Now, in that instance, or back then, there were no deep diving jerk baits. We were doing things to try to get our bait to dive as deep as possible. So we were throwing 6 pound tests, we were throwing spinning rods, we may be weighting the jerk baits a little bit, but for the most part, we were getting our baits down to 6 or 7 feet. And that was working at times, but as the season progresses, a lot of those fish were moving deeper, and we could not get the baits down to the fish. We could not draw the fish up because the water temperatures were so cool and they're just so much more lethargic that there was too much separation between our baits and where the fish were at. So one of the things that I did back then was try to figure out how to get baits down to those fish that I could work in a similar manner as a jerkbait, because the jerkbait was generating a lot of bites as long as you could get it down to where the fish were at. But as soon as they got deeper than where you could get your jerkbait to, you couldn't generate bites. So what we started doing back then was throwing more crankbaits. And one of the keys to a crankbait is you can get your crankbait much deeper. The problem is you can't get it to suspend. And when you get really cold water temperatures, a lot of times you want your bait to stay in that strike zone for 5, 10, 30 seconds because it takes that long for the fish to react and get to your bait, which is why a suspending jerk bait works so well in cold water. You know, since since that time, there have come out a few different models of suspending baits, but for the most part, you still don't really have any options. You've got like this is a Rapala Shad Wrap that's a suspending model. Works great. The problem is it doesn't really get much deeper than today's deep diving jerk baits, your plus ones, plus twos. In fact, they'll get deeper than that. So that doesn't work that good. There is a company out there called Baker Lures that have several different deep diving suspending crankbaits, which do work decent. I've got a handful of them. I've caught some fish on them. I unfortunately don't have one here because it's in my boat and I don't have my boat at the moment. But so they do work great. But other than that, it comes up to you guys to have to figure out how to get your crankbaits to suspend, because the crankbait you can get down to the right depth, but you can't necessarily keep it there. But there are things, guys, that you can do to keep your jerkbait down in the strike zone. So, for instance, I like to throw a deep diving crankbait like this Berkeley Dredger. But there's a couple of things that I like to do to make sure I can get it to suspend. Now, here's one key. If you're talking about crankbaits, crankbaits all have they all have different float rates. They all are built differently to dive differently. Like in this case, this dredger has some weight in the lip to really get it to bite to dive deep quick. Well, that's great, but it also kind of counteracts a little bit when the bait floats up. The weights keep it like this and it floats up higher and faster, which in the summer or warm water is something I absolutely want. But one key with this crankbait, and this is something you got to figure out with the crankbaits that you want to make suspend, is to figure out how it floats. So if this floats up, tail up first, you're going to want to wait the bait a little bit to keep it more levelly suspended in the water. Because if you can do that, the bait's not going to float up as fast. Now, generally speaking, I still like my crankbaits to float very slowly upward versus sinking. If I can get it to suspend perfectly, that's great. Generally speaking, that's really tough to do. But in a case like this bait, where it really wants to rise tail up first, a couple of things you can do. One, I would recommend replacing the back treble hook with one size bigger. So this is a size 2. In this case, I've got some Fusion 19 size 1s. I can replace that back treble hook, which will help keep the tail down because it's been weighted and balanced based on these size 2 hooks. So that's one thing you can do. If you have a bait that really wants to rise tail up first, because if it rises tail up first, it's going to rise faster because it's more aerodynamic in the water, or it slices through the water better. So if you can get it to sit like this and come up that way, it will suspend much better versus coming up tail first. So you may need to weight the back end. You can put bigger treble hooks on. You can do another tip is you can use some lead wrapping and wrap the treble hook to add some weight to it. This is just some lead wrap that I've got here that I carry with me. Another tip is to go up a size in fluorocarbon line. Fluorocarbon line sinks, the heavier pound test that you go with adds more weight and resistance in the water. So it does limit you in terms of your diving depth, but once you get it down to that level, it helps keep your bait down. So it won't allow your bait to rise up as fast. So those are those are 3 things that I will do to try to get my suspending jerkbait to suspend in the water. Now, when it comes to working the bait, I don't work it the same way I would work a jerkbait. What I'll do is I'll burn it down like I normally would to get it down to roughly its maximum diving depth. And at that point, it's much harder. Like if you were to try to twitch this like a jerkbait, you almost end up walking it in the water. It doesn't quite dart as good as you'd want a jerkbait to do. So what I'll do is I'll just do a quick sweep of the rod. So I'll reel it down and then I'm just going to pull it pretty hard and let it stop. And when I stop it, the momentum of the bait will give it a little bit of darting motion, but really what you're doing is just trying to move your bait 4 or 5 feet forward and then let it sit there. If you can get it down to the bottom, that's great. Generally speaking, with this technique, I'm not looking to grind the bottom like I would a normal crankbait. I want this bait to be suspending 2, 3, 4 feet off the bottom, similar to how you would work a jerkbait, meaning, a jerkbait's generally not grinding in the bottom, you're keeping it above the top of the fish. The key here is a bait like this, I can get down into that 16 to 18 foot range. And if I'm fishing, say, a 20-foot break or 20-foot point, I can get this down to within 3 or 4 feet of the fish versus a jerkbait, which even if you're using a deep diving jerkbait, you're only getting down to 8, 10, maybe 12 feet. And if you're talking about water temps that are in the 40-degree range, those fish that are down in that 20 to 22 foot range are not generally going to come up to 10 foot under the surface to eat that bait. It's just, unless you've got the perfect conditions, they would much rather have that bait 2, 3, 4 feet above their heads. You increase the chances of those fish eating it. So to me, one very, very underutilized technique is to weight your crankbaits to make them basically a suspending crankbait. Like I said, there's Baker lures, there's a Shad Raps, there's probably a few other suspending ones that I'm missing out there, but they tend to not come in suspending models, which means you need to take your favorite crankbaits, figure out how to balance them correctly, and get them down to the point where they suspend or slowly rise up. And when I mean slowly, I'm talking about a foot every 5 or 6 seconds. I mean, you just want it kind of just barely moving it to the point where when you get it down to the strike zone, when you let it sit for 5 or 10 seconds, it's not really moving from where it was at. It may have gone that far, but it's not that big of a difference. But I can assure you, you will get a whole pile of bites on your suspending crankbaits, just like you will your suspending jerkbaits. It just takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out which crankbaits need weight where. Is it the tail weighted? Is it in the front? Generally speaking, the more buoyant the bait, the harder it is to get it to suspend. So a lot of times your wood balsa baits don't generally work great for this technique. You're better off going with a molded plastic one, in my opinion, because they generally don't float as high. But don't be afraid to weight your crankbaits, guys. That's one of the keys this time of year. When you get that really cold water, the fish do not want to chase your baits. They're not going to come up nearly as far. So you got to get your bait down to them. And a crankbait is a great way to generate those reaction strikes. And you can fish it pretty similar to a jerkbait. So I hope this was helpful. Give it a try. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned. We'll have a new one coming out tomorrow.